Thank you to everybody who commented very nice things, and also to people who commented critical things on last week's film. I very much appreciate all of the feedback. In this video I'm going to be going over some aspects of the history and also a few aspects of the technical details of making the film. And I obviously won't be able to cover everything. A large section will be dedicated to the language, where I know I've made a few mistakes. Some people pointed out that the form of the word Anhaga in the title should be Anhagan rather than Anhagas. Mostly I made that mistake because I think Anhaga is not recorded in the genitive form that I needed, although yeah, I should have been able to tell from the sort of shape of the word what the ending would be. So there's proof right from the off that I have made mistakes. I wanted to film this in a way that seemed immersive, and I realised there's no way of filming things that everybody would experience as immersive. I'm thinking of doing a video soon on how a camera is different from an eye, and why it's so difficult to make that kind of leap. But simulating eyesight is a minefield. I tried it a little bit in this scene with Scott, with a bit of zoom blur around the edges to simulate the fact that there's less detail in our peripheral vision, but it wasn't perfect, obviously. One of my favourite films in terms of immersion is At Eternity's Gate, where Benoit Delhomme was responsible for most of the cinematography, I think. And in that film it's as if some ghost cameraman is actually in the room just pointing the camera at whatever seems interesting while the action goes on. Watching it made me feel almost like I myself had been in the room filming it. And this kind of filming works best when the camera is as close to the human holding it as possible, which means handheld. A gimbal would have made it hard to manoeuvre, and if you want to be able to get really close to the ground and just move naturally, the trade-off is going to be shaky camera work in a lot of cases. To me, this is part of filming in real life, and so when I watch something like this, it feels immersive to me. It's not that everything's been meticulously planned out to accommodate the camera and pretend it's not there, but acknowledging that the camera is there but that the characters can't see it. At Eternity's Gate avoided some of the shakiness because they used pretty wide-angle lenses. Having a wider angle lens means that more degrees of the world in front of the camera are packed into the same size screen, so any small shaking movement takes up a smaller percentage of the angle that you can see. My friend gave me a 14mm lens about halfway through filming, which was the kind of wide angle that I wanted, and as a result some of the earlier shots are shakier than I would have liked. For the walking shot at the end, Scott actually used the tripod like a gimbal to absorb some of the handshake, putting two of the legs over his shoulders and using the third one to control it. Props to Scott for the very good falling shot he orchestrated. I wish I'd gone from a higher branch, but I was a scaredy cat.
Yep.
The consonant system of late West Saxon Old English has been described in plenty of videos, and I think I've broadly kept to it in this video, in this film. If anyone notices any perceived mistakes, let me know and I can either address them or apologise for them. The vowel system is what I expect to maybe get some questions about or some criticism on. There are definitely instances where I've made mistakes in the vowel system over the course of this film. Some of these pieces were recorded earlier than others, so some of them I'm better informed than others. In general, the late West Saxon vowel system is reconstructed as having had 7 contrastive vowel qualities, which are e, u, u, e, o, a, and r. The exact qualities of these sounds are not absolutely known, and there's a certain amount of wiggle room. The ones I've just given there are, well, maybe the most likely candidates for the qualities of each phoneme, but there's a certain amount of potential wiggle room. So, for one thing, each of these vowel qualities can be either short or long, and the length of a vowel can change the meaning of a word. This is something that exists in some dialects of English, so Australian English in particular has has contrastive vowel length quite strongly. British English has a few pairs of vowels which contrast only on length, so the vowels in bed and bed, the vowels in bid and beard. This comes from earlier ear and air, which were centering diphthongs, smoothing to monophthongs ear and air, although plenty of people, including me, still pronounce the near vowel as a diphthong, near, in certain situations. So having some level of vowel length sensitivity in my own dialect, I think I can reasonably well produce vowel length distinctions, and I'm pretty happy with the way I've done it in this film. If you don't have contrastive vowel length in your own language at all, you might hear pairs of short and long vowels and think that maybe the long one should be longer, but in reality the difference is normally fairly subtle, and may only be obvious to somebody who's used to those kinds of differences. My intuition about this is obviously not perfect, because my vowel system doesn't have a full set of contrastive long-short pairs, and with words like hús, meaning house, my brain wants to default to the Scottish way of saying it, maybe with a slightly more backed vowel. So Scottish people often have a monophthong in this word, like hús, but Scottish people also don't have contrastive vowel length in their dialect for the most part. I'm not sure if there are any dialects of Scots that have it. And this means that the way this word is pronounced in Scottish, the vowel is more clipped than it probably was in Old English, where it was a long vowel with a short vowel that it contrasted with. So in Old English, this word was probably not hús, but hús. I make this mistake a few times in this video, so sorry about that. There are some distinctions that were made pretty robustly in Old English, if spelling evidence is anything to go by, that disappeared in the early Middle English period, depending on where in the country you were. And those are the distinction between front and back low vowels, a and and the distinction between rounded and unrounded high front vowels, I and U. Because changes in pronunciation happen before the corresponding change in writing happens, I've decided that these two changes may already have been on their way to happening in some dialects in speech at the time this film is set. Sometimes you'll hear me pronounce the front a vowel kind of backed to a low central vowel like a, and this even happens when it comes before a glide, like in the word my. My was on knaust, which in textbook Old English pronunciation would be something like may. The long equivalent of the low front vowel, I alternate between having it as just a straight long low front vowel a, and having a slightly higher quality like a. It was probably on its way to having a quality like a at the time this film is set, or maybe even higher, air. We can't really tell. The pronunciation I've used for the most part in this film is fairly conservative for the time, but some dialects are conservative, so I don't think that's, I think that's well within the realm of creative license. Within the long-short pairs, sometimes I've made the short vowel allophonically more lax than the long vowel. This depends on whether it's pronounced in isolation or whether it's pronounced in a kind of a position of high stress within the sentence. If it's pronounced with high sentential stress, then sometimes I'll go for a more tense quality, like for example I. If it's pronounced in a position of lower sentential stress, I'll go for a laxer quality like I. There's a bit of debate around whether the short vowels were qualitatively laxer in Old English than their long counterparts. I think it may have been an allophonic thing, and that's what I've settled on here. Again, I think that's well within the range of creative license. I think that's a real possibility. I think that there may be times that I have trouble keeping apart the long and short equivalents of the diphthongs, which are normally reconstructed as u, eu, el, el, al, al. Also, at this stage, the the long version of the our diphthong may well have been raising its first element to something like air, so something closer to air, which I probably, if I were to make this whole film from scratch again, I would make an effort to do that. Although our is likely to have been the pronunciation of that vowel at some point in the history of Old English, and I'm just saying that this particular dialect is conservative in that regard, and it's within the realm of creative license, although probably not the most common realisation of that diphthong at this time. There are also some instances of the short version of that diphthong, ow, being pronounced more like ah, and I think that this is realistic in rapid speech because, for one thing, the low central ah quality is between the two target qualities of that diphthong, as it's normally described by historical linguists, and also because, again, this diphthong did actually smooth to something that I think was probably a low central vowel in the Middle English period. So that's again one of these things that we may have seen in rapid speech at this point that later became a part of the normal pronunciation of the language. Grammar is something I've struggled with in past videos like this, so I'm now going to go through some of the speech in the film bit by bit and try to justify the decisions I've made. I'm absolutely open to correction here, I'm not an expert in this, and if you're a learner of Old English you should watch this with extreme caution because I'm also a learner of Old English. Having said that, this is worded in almost exactly the way that Ormin introduces himself in the Ormulum from the 1100s. He says, "Itwas there christened was, Ormin by name named." I was there I christened was, Ormin by name named. Notice even within that sentence, Ormin flips between ich and e for the first person pronoun, something Baldrick does in this film. This is my first mistake that I'm surprised I made, especially this early on. If something is on somewhere, then the somewhere should take the dative case. This should be harme, not harm. I don't know if a dative form of feurlin is attested anywhere, but I'd guess it would be something like feurlinum, unless I'm missing something. Ich was mane child is basic word order, subject, verb, adjective describing object, object. Old English didn't have an indefinite article, so instead of saying I was a common child, you'd just say I was common child. Swaswaich mane wereum, literally so I common man am. Swaswa seems to have been a common way of saying in the same way as, so in Old English versions of the Lord's Prayer you see on eldran swaswa on heavenum, on earth as it is in heaven. You'll notice the verb elm jumps to the end of the sentence here. I think that's appropriate in this situation because it's a subordinate clause, a sentence within a sentence, but I'm happy to be corrected on that. Here I'm treating the reason for which I now live in the Holt as functionally the noun phrase, so the noun is has come afterwards. Hopefully sending the verb to the end of this noun phrase is appropriate. I lost my house stupid way. Here I haven't put any preposition, like on or in. Because Old English had endings that marked grammatical case, the preposition wasn't always necessary, and indeed you see them left out quite a lot in literature. Here I've made a contraction. I've reduced ich to just ch attached to the start of the word elm, chelm. I don't think there's direct evidence for this in Old English, but there are some English dialects that retain the ch in ich into Shakespeare's time, and in those dialects there's written evidence of contractions like chill for ich will. Given that contractions are quite common in modern languages, I've done that here. Again, on holte, you have this dative form of halt because it comes after the preposition on. I don't know where I got the long vowel in fortham. I think that might be a mistake. Nan man is an attested way of saying nobody. Drevath should have a long vowel. That's another mistake. Because this is a kind of subordinate clause, I didn't know whether to send the verb to the end. I decided not to because there's enough of a pause that I think he's saying nan man drevath me as a separate sentence from fortham, or forthum, or however you want to say that, which was just a kind of filler in this situation. I think this is pretty conventional word order. I can speak with people being subject, verb, object, and then the subordinate clause having the verb sent to the end. I don't know if mid is the most appropriate preposition, whether you'd speak mid people or speak tall people or what, but prepositions are a bit of a wild card in some Old English texts, and they differ a lot between modern dialects, so I went with this one. For people not used to Old English, notice that the word with at this point means against. So here I've used it in the sense of walking in the opposite direction, walking against him, which is maybe a bit of a stretch from the attested meaning, but semantics differ between dialects. My wezon sun knaust. My wezon literally means may be, and it's not attested as far as I know. I thought that it was within my creative license to have this as a contractive form of it may be true, just as a stock phrase people used in this invented dialect for the film. He uses thu, the singular second person pronoun, because he's only addressing one person, the viewer, or however you want to interpret what the viewer is. In Old English, negation is usually done by putting ne before the verb. I mistakenly gave ne a long vowel throughout this film.
Gartsum shopas on hold to tell the folk that spell.
This was possibly a mistaken word order choice, putting the verb first. I've omitted the pronoun in the second bit. Omitting the subject of a sentence is seen in Old English texts, and I think a similar thing happens in German with pronouns sometimes. I think I should have used the dative plural of folk, not the dative singular. I also don't know why I went with telle, which is the first person singular form. That presumably that's a mistake, and I don't know what I was thinking there.
To shop thai childwas.
I remember the shop, that standard word order. I put the verb to the end in the subordinate clause.
Slapt on flore und raad
Standard word order here, and I think it's acceptable for the adverb to go after the verb, as in raad Michel. The only bit of creative license, I think, was using Michel as an adverb rather than an adjective.
We waren overglad, thought he might do nekom.
I think I've covered all aspects of word order here. I've used over as an adjective here, which as far as I know isn't attested at all this early on. This is a bit of dialect creative license.
I
considered using tha here instead of juanne, but juanne is attested in this context, so I've used it. I may actually leave that there because I think I've given you some idea of the thought process and of the kinds of mistakes I tend to make. Please bear in mind that I haven't claimed to be an expert in Old English grammar here. This is a creative project, not an academic one, and I hope the errors don't detract too much from the film. Now for the visual aspects of the film. As for clothing, throughout the film, Baldric wears an undyed linen tunic, a grey woolen overtunic and blue linen trousers. I got these from Grimfrost, and because they're aiming for a Scandinavian style, and because Baldric is supposed to be relatively poor, I avoided anything too complicated or with any pattern on it that might be obviously Scandinavian. Blue dye was available in the early medieval period, despite how garish it might look, and it seems to have been relatively cheap depending on what kind of dye you used. A good go-to resource for this kind of thing is Gail Owen Crocker's dress in Anglo-Saxon England. A tunic that's knee-length or shorter is appropriate, and so is wearing wool on top of linen. Owen Crocker says that we can be fairly certain that Anglo-Saxon men wore trousers. The one thing I didn't include was a belt, because I wasn't confident enough in my ability to purchase an accurate one with an accurate buckle. The idea of Baldric's costume is that it's the sort of thing a very poor person might wear, if they had no choice. I regret not having Scott wear a belt as Bradlach, because I think that would have produced more of a contrast, and I don't want people going away with the idea that all early medieval clothing was undecorated and bland. Baldric's hair changes several times throughout the film. In some scenes it's fairly unkempt and just brushed out of his face with a middle parting, in others it's flopped forwards over his head, in others it's neater with a kind of straight fringe at the front. He sometimes has a moustache and a goatee. Moustaches and beards are dotted throughout early medieval depictions of people, and short hair with a fairly straight fringe at the front can be seen in some depictions from around the time this film is set. When the parting is obvious, it's a centre parting. It's probably obvious to a lot of people, but razors have been around since at least the Bronze Age, and there's no reason why Baldric couldn't have taken care of his appearance occasionally. He has sideburns in a lot of scenes, which isn't from the literature, despite how kind of old-timey it might look. When I cut mine off, they grow back very quickly, within a week or two, and they're a bit of a pain to get rid of. So that's why I have them, and that's why Baldric has them, because, you know, if I was in his situation, I wouldn't bother to cut them off. You know, that doesn't necessarily mean he wouldn't, but that's the decision I've made. Owen Crocker suggests that being barefoot might not have been that unusual for a lower class English person at that time. What about farming and land management? A few times here I show shots from Butser Ancient Farm in Hampshire. You see small brown sheep and relatively large beige black and white goats. You see an enclosed landscape with a finished house, an unfinished house, a smaller outbuilding, an enclosure with goats and a pile of hazel rods. Here we turn to Banham and Faith's textbook on early medieval English farming. Both of the dissertations I wrote in my degree were about animal remains. Goats and sheep are hard to tell apart in the archaeological record. There's so much overlap in the shape of their bones that often only their skulls give them away, and as Banham and Faith point out, intact skulls don't normally appear in cooking assemblages. But from written sources it's clear that goats were less common than sheep. As I've found out in my interactions with these goats specifically, they're hard to contain, and the authors suggest that they might have been kept more away from settlements, in which case my picture here is inaccurate. But if the idea is that Baldric has stolen this man's goats in the past, keeping them closer to home might well be justified. The goats at Butser are English goats, which is the name of the breed, and they're bigger than early medieval goats were, although given they're not shown next to any humans in this film, I don't think that really comes across. The sheep are Manx Lochtons, and although they're not exact analogues for early medieval sheep, they're more accurate size-wise than the goats are. The colours of both species at this time are not clear. The domestic geese at the end fit very neatly with Banham and Faith's line, Anglo-Saxon geese may have had white plumage. Anglo-Saxon domestic geese were descended from wild greylag geese, so an orange beak and feet seem likely. A few wild animals make an appearance, and these are all native: the red fox, the mallard, the mute swan, a dead house sparrow. I didn't kill this, it flew into my dad's kitchen window and sadly killed itself. What I think is a speckled wood butterfly, a stag beetle, a woodlouse, a coal tit, and I think that may be it. At various points you see coppiced hazel used to make fences and things. Coppiced wood was heavily relied on to make wattle and fencing and all kinds of other things. I used to help out on a working copse with a wonderful man called Darren, who also built most of the Anglo-Saxon buildings on the farm. So what about the situation? Is this realistic? From what we can piece together, Baldric had a house, a wife, 2 goats and a cow in Mayton. He stole a goat from somebody else, and this resulted in him somehow losing his house to this other man. He's now living away from any settlements, and his brother's looking for him. The literature we have suggests that, quite understandably, livestock were wealth in early medieval England. The word ferch could mean cattle or wealth, and it survived as the modern word fee in the financial sense. Stealing livestock was stealing someone's work and their health and their security. One early medieval charm is intended to recover stolen livestock and curse whoever stole them so that they wither away. I don't know of any record of people being kicked out of their homes for livestock theft, but I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility that some kind of very significant recompense might be expected, especially if you'd stolen livestock from somebody powerful. Baldric becomes an isne, a servant to the man he stole from. He doesn't want to be a servant, so maybe out of stubbornness he leaves. As I see it in my own little universe here, this isn't something that happens to all people who steal livestock, but it's a result of the specific circumstances of Baldric's life. The symptoms of ergotism are semi-well studied because certain medications can cause it, but symptoms of ergot poisoning fall into the gangrenous category and the convulsive category. Medications normally cause the gangrenous symptoms, but epidemics of ergotism resulting from people eating dodgy barley often result in convulsive symptoms. In this film we see what seem like muscle spasms and mild light and colour hallucinations, both of which are recorded symptoms. It seems like these symptoms are caused by overstimulation of serotonin receptors in the central nervous system. Although serotonin is often thought of as a happy chemical, it modulates a lot of different things in the central nervous system, and too much of it, or things resembling it, can be dangerous. The idea of elves is a cultural one that I've talked about in other videos. I don't think Baldric thought elves were responsible because he had psychosis. I think that people thought of elves as a normal part of the landscape, and the confusion and sickness caused by ergot poisoning might have been attributed to elves. Unfortunately, there are no specific descriptions of early medieval illnesses that can be solidly pinned down to convulsive ergotism, because hallucinations and psychosis are among the effects, and how these things affect a person will depend on their culture. And that means it's almost impossible to make any kind of solid diagnosis like that from textual evidence alone. Thank you very much indeed for watching this. and I will come to you soon with a video not about that film.